On 6 of the world's 7 continents, there are in total precisely 0 peaks whose summits reach or exceed a max elevation of 7,000 meters, with the closest runner-up being the massive, yet surprisingly accessible 6,961 meter peak Aconcagua, located in the heart of the Argentinian Andes in South America. Notably, however, the continent of Asia is home to both the Himalayas and the Karakoram Range, 2 mountain ranges that longtime viewers of my mountaineering content are all too familiar with by now, as both the Karakoram and Himalayas are home to some of the highest, most difficult, and dangerous mountains on Earth to successfully ascend, including all 14 8,000 meter plus peaks in the world, all of which I've covered in videos in the past here on my channel. These so-called 8,000ers garner a majority of attention in both the greater public consciousness as well as amongst mountaineers, as particularly the world's highest summit, Mount Everest, is a highly sought-after ascent for a majority of mountaineers. However, as my frequent viewers are undoubtedly aware, but those newer to the channel may be surprised to learn, it is not the 8,000ers that draw the attention of mountaineering's upper echelon, but rather, usually, the many lesser-known 7,000ers scattered across the region. While these 7,000ers are dwarfed by the 8,000ers in their total height, many of the 7,000ers are significantly more technically demanding, but also much more dangerous and frequently deadly than the 8,000ers, as the very often incorrectly cited most deadly summit in the world, the 8,091 meter peak Annapurna, sports a death to successful summit ratio of 16%, meaning that for every 100 climbers who reach the summit successfully, 16 climbers will perish while attempting to do so. In comparison, the 7,556 meter peak Mount Ganga, which I covered in another one of my videos a few months back, sports a startlingly bleak death to successful summit ratio of 125%, meaning that for every 100 people who reach the summit successfully, 125 people will die attempting to do so. Now, as frequent viewers of my channel are aware, I have covered quite a few of these lesser known, brutally difficult to ascend summits here on the channel, and it's not uncommon that I can fit an entire peak's climbing history, including every ascent and ascent attempt, neatly within a single video, as due to a varied combination of their relative obscurity and infamous reputations, these peaks frequently sport less than 10 total attempts to reach their summits throughout their recorded climbing histories. One peak that fits such a description is the 7,590 meter high and amusingly redundantly named Mount Peak 38, otherwise known as Shartse, although the reason for its sparse climbing history is likely in no small part due to the former of the aforementioned reasons, as it happens to quite literally be located in the shadow of 3 of the 14 8,000ers, with its ridges connecting with both Lhotse and by extension Mount Everest, with the massive 8,485 meter peak Makalu located just to its east. However, this is not to dismiss the high difficulty of reaching its summit, as well as the many dangers that line its slopes, which I'll be touching on a little later on in the video. Notably, Mount Peak 38 itself, or Shartse I, has an extremely sparse climbing history, as there have been just 3 attempts to reach its summit throughout the years, with the first ascent attempt taking place as recently as the year 1997, when a Russian expedition team would attempt to ascend the peak from the steep southern ridge leading to the summit of Lhotse Shar, before they would descend to the summit of Mount Peak 38, and the team would contend with the steep and treacherous conditions on the mountain during their ascent attempt, while massive seracs constantly and ominously hung above them. After reaching an elevation of 6,400 meters, the Russian expedition team would retreat from the mountain and would state that the likely best route to reach Shartse's summit was via its 4-kilometer-long southeastern ridge instead. The next attempt to reach the summit would take place 5 years later in 2003, when a Czech expedition team would attempt to ascend the peak from its southeastern ridge and face. However, they would find that on the southern side, the entire ridgeline was lined with seracs clinging to it haphazardly above, which, paired with the loosely layered snow conditions below them, were ripe to trigger avalanches. The Czech team was ultimately forced to abandon their ascent after encountering chasm-like crevasses while ascending the face that the team would deem near impossible to circumnavigate, and they would call off their attempt after reaching an elevation of 6,150 meters. Finally, a South Korean expedition team in 2015 would arrive at the foot of Shartse's southern face and would manage to establish their base camp for their upcoming climb. However, their further efforts to ascend the peak would be unexpectedly derailed by the catastrophic series of powerful earthquakes that rocked Nepal in late April of 2015, which I made an entire video detailing a while back if you'd like to know more about them. Thus, at least as of the time of making this video, the coveted first ascent of the one and only Mount Peak 38 is still open for anyone bold enough to brave its hazardous slopes to claim. Now, the more astute viewers watching this video may have noticed that I referred to Mount Peak 38 as Shartse I earlier in the video, and this is because at the far eastern edge of the ridgeline lies a further distinct 7,457 meter high summit, Shartse II, otherwise known as the much less amusingly named Junction Peak. The first successful ascent of the peak would take place in 1974, when a 4-member West German expedition team reached its summit while doing reconnaissance for an ascent of Lhotse from the long southeastern ridge containing Shartse I and II. Notably, after reaching the 7,457 meter summit of Shartse II, one of the expedition team's members would chronicle in his notes regarding the feasibility of ascending Lhotse via the long ridgeline, writing, quote, "The reconnaissance is completed. Good luck to those who go further." The next and most recent successful ascent of Shartse II would take place 10 years later in May of 1984, accomplished by a South Korean-led expedition team who made their ascent via the southwest face of the peak, with most of the team's members suffering a number of various non-life-threatening injuries over the course of the climb, which would ultimately derail the expedition team's greater ambitions to ascend other lesser-known peaks in the area that season. As of the time of making this video, there has been only one further attempt to summit Shartse II, which would take place 4 years later in October of 1988. On October 14th, 1988, a French 3-man expedition team consisting of the team's leader, a man named Eric Baudet, a man named Jean-Marc Perrault, and a man named Jean-Louis Letron, who notably was serving the role of the small team's doctor. The team would establish their base camp on the southern side of the peak and would be attempting to ascend Shartse II via its steep southern face. The trio would immediately begin to make their way up Shartse II's sheer slopes, making slow but steady progress up them, and would establish their Camp 1 at an elevation of 5,300 meters 2 days later on October 16th. The party's progress was similarly glacial over the following few days, as the trio continued to trudge their way up the mountainside towards their planned location for their Camp 2 at an elevation of 6,220 meters. 5 days after establishing their Camp 1 at 5,300 meters on October 21st, the trio of French climbers were still in the process of making their way up to their planned site for Camp 2 and had reached an elevation of 6,000 meters. While Eric was in the process of hammering in a piton for fixing their ropes, suddenly the team heard a crack from above as one of the many large overhanging seracs that lined the southern side of the ridgeline had broken loose and cascaded into the blanket of loose snow beneath it, triggering a rapid-moving, sweeping avalanche that billowed down the mountainside straight towards the three men. Eric, who was leading the group at the time, found himself directly in the path of the powerful avalanche, which swept him up and sent him tumbling down the mountainside, enveloped in the wave of fast-moving snow and debris. Jean-Marc, who was closest to Eric at the time of the avalanche, was the first of the trio to notice it, and while he was initially in the path of the avalanche, his early awareness of it allowed him just enough time to jump out of the way to avoid being completely swept up in the avalanche as well. After the avalanche had settled, the two surviving climbers would immediately set to work scanning the debris field for any signs of Eric, and it would not be long before the duo spotted what appeared to be Eric lying motionless amongst the rubble. After the pair made their way down to Eric, their worst fears would be confirmed, as upon closer inspection, they discovered that Eric's skull had been cracked open from an impact he suffered after he'd been swept up in the fast-flowing avalanche debris. In the aftermath of Eric's sudden death, the two remaining climbers would abandon their bid for the summit and began to make their retreat back to Camp 1 at 5,300 meters, which they would reach the following day on October 22nd. That evening, the duo at Camp 1 were barraged by fierce winds and snowfall throughout the night, as well as by avalanche debris from above, and the two men were forced to hold down their tent throughout the entire night to avoid being swept away by the falling debris from above. The duo would emerge the following morning to observe that the falling debris had been the result of a series of avalanches triggered on Lhotse Shar, which is the peak located between Shartse I and Lhotse. The two remaining climbers would successfully make their way back to base camp and retreated from the mountainside with heavy hearts. Notably, the two survivors would note that the climbers had been aware of the seracs looming above them during their climb, and had noted that they were not moving and did not appear to be threatening, and thus they had decided to proceed with their planned climb. Thank you all for watching.